Welcome to How to Cook That. I'm Ann Reardon and today we're going to be making a cake from 2,000 years ago. So how do we even know what they ate back then? Well, our trip to Italy helped us find some clues.
So we are here in ancient Pompeii, which was a city destroyed by an eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79. So 2,000 years ago almost, and a lot of it was preserved by the ash that fell over the course of really 1 or 2 days, just covered the entire city and has preserved that city for thousands of years. It's an incredible place.
To think that thousands of people lived here and they all died all at once, I think it's a bit eerie.
It's quite incredible, really, the size of it, how well preserved it is. It's basically untouched.
As we walked around Pompeii, we saw the fast food street vendor stands for selling hot meals and these huge stone mills for grinding corn and wheat into flour. These were all positioned in a bakery, and they even found preserved loaves of bread here. Bread is great, but I want to know about sweet food. A lot of the buildings have these ornate mosaics and paintings in the plaster, and about 10 minutes away from Pompeii there's a seaside villa thought to have been owned by Nero himself, and there you can see a painting of this cake on a pedestal. Cake stands have got a lot smaller over the years. According to pompeii.org.uk, this is likely to have been a dulcia piperata, or honey cake. I don't know if I said that right, but anyway. From their recipe it says we need flour, baking powder, rosemary, cinnamon, almonds, grape juice, passum, which is like a sweet white wine, honey, milk and chopped hazelnuts. My only problem with this recipe is that it has baking powder, and baking powder wasn't invented until 1843, so we're around 1,700 years too early for that. So I'm going to try and make this cake 3 ways. Once with baking powder like they've got suggested here, once using nothing at all, and once using yeast, which we know they had because they needed it for their bread. Okay, so let's start with 140 grams of flour. I don't have one of those huge stone mills like they had in Pompeii, but I did manage to get this smaller version. I guess I just pour some wheat kernels and let them fall down the hole in the middle there, and then turn it around. This is not heavy enough, I don't think. Look, it's just spitting out wheat down the bottom. That doesn't help me having whole wheat kernels. That's what I put into it. It's not grinding them at all. Don't buy one of these. Now, if I push down hard on it as I turn instead of using the handle, I can get some flour mixed in with whole wheat kernels coming out the other end. Now, if I lift the top off this, it's quite heavy, but you can see some of it is getting crushed, but lots of it is not getting crushed at all. Strangely enough, I have actually ground wheat before using a stone mill, and it should work really well, so this is definitely a dodgy model. If I tip that into a sieve, you'll be able to see we are getting some flour, but not enough to make a cake. So as soon as it's not working, I'm going to cheat and put the wheat kernels into my blender and grind it up that way. We have it so easy now with electrical appliances. We just don't even think about it. We just use them for everything. Next, we need half a teaspoon of ground rosemary. Rosemary is one of those herbs that's easy to grow in the garden. It's quite hardy. It grows really well in every state of Australia here. It's pretty hard to grind fresh rosemary though, but I'll resist the urge to put it in the blender with the flour. Let me just fast forward, put myself into blender speed. There we go, we've got some ground rosemary. Next, we need some ground almonds. Again, the blender would be super handy for this job. Baking even basic things just took them so long to do everything back then. Now we need some honey and some cinnamon. It's interesting that this recipe has no eggs and no oil. I wonder what it's going to taste like. So we ground our wheat to make flour, we crushed the almonds to make the almond meal, pounded the rosemary to break that up, and we've got the honey, cinnamon and baking powder, which as I said they didn't have back then, so I'm only going to use that in one of the cakes and not the others. We've also got here some milk, and they used a wine called passum. Now I couldn't get that here, so I'm swapping it for this one, which is apparently a thick sweet white wine, which is very similar to passum. So we'll start by adding the cinnamon to the bowl with the whole wheat flour and the crushed almonds and our rosemary, and stir that together. And you can see how out of place the very white baking powder looks compared to everything else, which is like these light brownish colours. Add in the honey and the milk and the wine and stir them together. Wow, that looks very healthy, very wholesome compared to normal cake batter. And now I'm going to split this into 3 bowls. To this one I'm adding baking powder. To this bowl I'm adding some instant dried yeast, and this one is staying plain with nothing. Mix those through and put them into cake pans. Now I assume they would have had pottery dishes to bake these in, but I don't have little pottery dishes, so forgive me for using metal baking tins. Now we need to leave the one with the yeast in it to rise, and you'll notice I didn't knead it because I don't want it to develop the gluten in it and become like a bread dough. I want it to have more of a cakey texture. We can bake the baking powder and plain ones straight away, just pop those into the oven, and while they're baking, chop up some hazelnuts. Once those are done, take them out of the oven and drizzle the top with honey, and then sprinkle some hazelnuts on top. And you want to do this while they're still hot so that honey kind of melts down into it and makes the hazelnuts stick. Our plain and baking powder ones are ready, but the one with yeast in it has only just risen to the top, so I'll put that one in the oven to bake now. Once that's done, you want to drizzle that one as well with your honey and add the nuts on top. Now we've got the one with no raising agent, the one with the baking powder, and lastly the one that had the yeast in it. The yeast one has quite big air bubbles on the outside compared to the others. If we slice that in half, we can see inside it looks a bit like a carrot cake. That actually looks really yummy. The baking powder one, if we cut that open, looks pretty much like a normal cake texture. And the one with no baking powder at all, well, that one is solid. There's no air bubbles to be found in it. Now to taste the 2,000-year-old cake recipe. The one with no raising agent, as you would imagine, is very dense. It had no air bubbles in it. It's a bit like eating, how can I describe it? It's a bit like eating a protein ball. It's that dense. It almost tastes fruity as well. It's like I can taste some apricot or maybe even some orange in there, which is weird because we didn't add any fruit. I'm wondering if that flavour is from the wine. The baking powder one, I can really taste the bitterness of the baking powder. I think it's not very sweet, this cake. It doesn't have a lot of honey in it, so just that little bit of baking powder is quite noticeable in it. The texture of it is nicer, but the flavour of the first one was better. Now for the yeast. This texture is quite cake-like. It's not exactly the same as with baking powder, but it's actually pretty good. And it tastes much more like the first one did without the baking powder flavour in it. You can taste a little bit of yeast, but it's not very strong. It's not overpowering. So if you want to recreate a 2,000-year-old cake, use yeast in your recipe, or you could use sourdough starter if you've got that. I didn't have any of that. And make sure you use freshly ground wheat. It gives it a really wholesome flavour to it. It's a bit like eating a whole wheat muffin almost, but it's different. You have to make it yourself and taste it. You can check out my other 200-year-old recipes here, or if you're not already subscribed, you can do that now. And a big thank you to my patrons and a shout out to my gold level patrons. You guys are amazing. If you'd like to join them, you can click here to do that. Make it a great week, and I'll see you on Friday.